Thank you so much for such a generous introduction, and thank you for such a refreshing and interesting presentation from Palestine and from Syria and from here. The title of my talk today is The Syrian Tragedy, Global Design, Regional Maps, and an Invisible Revolution. And I've been for almost 2 years and a half now trying to understand why is it that this revolution that many of us Syrians know that exists and is well and alive is so invisible here in the West and in other places. And I will argue that there are a number of reasons that make this revolution really invisible. A number of these reasons are theoretical, but also because we're looking at the wrong place. I spent almost 2 months this summer. I was in Manbij, a small city, a medium-sized actually city with 200,000 residents, plus another 200,000 refugees. And it was a spectacular experience. I mean, this was maybe the happiest time in my life. I really felt what freedom meant being there. And I felt that the most interesting discussions were happening in front of me. And I really understood only then what the revolution is, being there in Manbij for 2 months. And it was a really particular moment in time. It was beginning of June. I went there, and there were several very democratic institutions that were governing the city. And later on, we have seen the ISIS, the Islamic State, taking over and making everything much more difficult and much more challenging. It was a period where, in the beginning, there was one front, the state, and later on, we saw emerging a second front, much more porous, much more difficult to identify, and misleading for some Syrians. And I would disagree that Syrians are jihadi. I think Syrians are pious, yes, and they can go either way, depending on what's available and what their choices are. So I'm going to try to understand why is it that what I saw is so invisible here. Why is it that we can't really see that revolution? Why is it that this multi-dimensional revolution, and here I'm not talking about the military aspect. I think that the military aspect is just one minor part of the revolution. It's really the tip of the iceberg. And the much more interesting part is really invisible. It's never in the news. It's very rarely, in the reports or the blogs. There are many of the people who actually write about that part are here and spoke today, and thank you to them. But otherwise, we're really minoritarian. We are really silenced, and we don't have a voice in that, that revolution. And gentleman spoke earlier. He was really interesting, educating us on that revolution and imperialism and so on. One more thing before I describe what I mean by the wrong theoretical framework that are really being used to understand the Syrian Revolution. When I went there, I asked a few questions, but the most fascinating part is Manbij was liberated totally peacefully. And as I said, it's almost 500,000 people because the refugees were there very early on. They were fleeing other areas. And in the beginning, it was scary. Any Syrian, knows what are the stakes to organize a protest, what it means to be arrested, and that oftentimes, you don't get out of prison. You get tortured and killed. And so people were taking those risks, and they were protesting, and they were ingenious in their protest. And we can talk about that later. I want to be as quick as I can, but I think that they were really creative in doing that. And just to give you an idea about, we heard a lot of discussion about the military and the civilian and so on. The FSA, the Free Syrian Army, was really, really marginal in Manbij. The day of the liberation, there were a couple of people, maybe 10, 15 people who considered themselves FSA, Free Syrian Army, and they had 17 machine guns. And they used them just very few, at very few occasions. That's it. And the city was liberated overnight. The problem is, when you have the city liberated overnight, and I gave the example of Boston because that's where I live, try to think about what it means. Institutions, providing for an entire population, governing a city and making it livable is what I'm going to suggest is the revolution, and is what people have been doing for 2.5 years now, and is where we should be looking to understand and recognize and accept that there is a real revolution. And I don't care whether the jihadi are going to win or not. I think that we're winning anyway, because people are learning that democracy, and they're actually building it, and they are practicing it as they are working. And sometimes they make errors, but it's happening. It's on the ground. And they are, even if they are pious and religious and so on, they are democratic, at least in Manbij. Again, I don't want to overgeneralize, because there are differences in different places and so on, and some of the local councils are manipulated, they're puppet, they're not really functioning, but Manbij is really a good example, and there are many others. It's not a unique example. So to go back, before I talk about Manbij and give more account from the ground, I want to suggest that for the most part what we hear about Syria are basically three major frameworks. And those are used in academic circles, they're used by journalists, they're used in the media to explain and tell people what is happening in Syria. The first one, and I'm sure that everyone is used to that one, the critical and uncritical geopolitics. That's really the dominant one, it's everywhere. The second one is Marxian political economy, and here I'm talking about the lazy type of Marxian political economy, people who are, in their offices and telling us about where the working class is and the unions, and celebrating the unions that are manipulated by the Syrian regime, and they don't even know that. I'm talking about stars, big stars, people like John Rees, who is still waiting for the unions to declare their stance for the revolution and support the revolution, and he doesn't know that the unions have been completely dismantled in 1980. There are no unions. There are bureaucrats who take their orders from the Ba'ath Party. So he can still wait. So this is the lazy type of Marxian political economy that's going on, and I think this is an insult to political economy. And the third type is the left and right-leaning humanitarianism, and I'm going to explain why. And I think we need more complexity. I'm not downplaying the importance of each one of those methods, and the importance of each one of these entry points. I think that there is value to do geopolitics. There is value to do a Marxian political economy, but it doesn't take 2 hours and few, Googling to do that. It takes much more time. The first and second approaches are really top-down, and they have a tendency to explore the everyday experience of millions of Syrians from an airplane, without going on the ground and really understanding what's happening and what people are doing and the type of discussion that they're having, and so on and so forth. The third one, the humanitarian approach, is, and several people have pointed out that today, has a tendency to deny any agency to the Syrian and consider them victims. And this is not how people are dealing with the humanitarian, if we want to call that the humanitarian question in Syria. Whether they are working with the Red Crescent or in field hospital or so many different ways, they don't consider themselves as, they're not helping the victims, or they're not helping the helpless or the voiceless. They consider that as part of the revolution. They consider themselves revolutionary. And they are making the revolution possible by providing and doing that. So this is a very different understanding from some of the international NGOs who come to help, and that's not how many Syrians perceive their work. And so instead of doing that, I want to suggest another way to approach Syria. In addition, again, sometimes people misunderstand me. In addition to the geopolitical and the Marxian political economy and so on, I'm suggesting another way to look at the Syrian uprising. And I'm using here Henri Lefebvre, the French philosopher, who suggested that there are always at least two or three ways to understand and approach a space, a social space. There is the lived experience or the lived space, and there is the abstract spaces. The abstract space is the one that usually is produced by technocrats, bureaucrats, urbanists, politicians, geostrategists. It can be summarized by the map. It's drawing a map, and it's closely it's usually used by the state to further state interest. And so that's the abstract space. Really the view from the airplane, from top-down kind of approach. And then the second approach is the lived space that Henri Lefebvre talks about. And this requires being embedded with the population and listening to their language and accepting that language, even if we don't like, some of the language. They don't necessarily use fancy words. They don't necessarily, use participatory democracy, even when they are doing it. And this is what I tried to do by embedding myself in Manbij and going to other places and seeing that over and over again in so many different places. And this is how, this is why I'm so hopeful. I think that this slogan that the Syrian borrowed from the Egyptian, despair is betrayal, is very important. We can't afford to despair. We have to be hopeful. And I think there are reasons to be hopeful. This participatory democracy that people are building day in, day out, thousands of people, millions of people, is what I'm calling here the Syrian Revolution. So before going there and describing what happened in Manbij, I want to briefly talk about the different geopolitical maps. And here, we can superimpose those maps. Sometimes people have a tendency to simplify those maps and use one map to read an extremely complex situation. I think it's more important to superimpose several geopolitical maps, because different states have different interests. And each one of those states have a different conceptualization of, here I'm literally speaking about the geographic space and geopolitics in the sense that they can draw a map. They're not all state actors, some of them are not, and I'm going to bash a little bit the international left that we were talking about, because they have embraced that state interest and they are advancing and they're drawing those maps, those same maps, geopolitical maps. And the reason for this multiplicity and fragmentation in the maps is due to the declining power of the US. In the past, as we all know here, the US used to dictate whatever needs to be done in the region, and it was done. Today, it's not the same story anymore, and this is combined with a major crisis. Monarch and autocrats have much more margin to bargain and negotiate, and therefore they can advance their own maps. And so instead of the emir being invited to Washington and being dictated what is to be done in the coming years, now the emir is rebelling and he has his own different interests and different strategies for the region. That's why we have several maps, and I think it's important. The first one is the mini-war or mini-Cold War between Russia and the United States. And contrary to common belief, I think that the US is really undecisive and uninterested in Syria. It doesn't really want to go, as Nader and many others have pointed out, to go there. They don't want to give any weapons to the rebel. And this was happening actually since the beginning. They didn't wait for the jihadis to emerge and become powerful to refuse, to give them any kind of weapons. They were refusing that since the beginning. And their interest and their focus has been shifting to East Asia and Central Asia for the emergence of China as an important economic power, but also for the global economic crisis, questions of environment, climate change, and global terrorism. And this has been happening with Bush. It's not something new, but Obama is following in the same path. But they're interested in containing the power of Russia and undermining anything that Russia does in the region. And that's why they are present. And sometimes people confuse that with interest in helping the rebels and so on. The second reason is containing the Arab revolts and really destroying this momentum and this revolutionary spirit. I'm very interested and was very interested, and they teach courses on the global protest and the Occupy movement and so on, and they've met many people who were working with the Occupy movement. And every group, whether in Canada or here in the US, told me that this would not have been possible without the Arab revolt, and especially the Egyptian revolution. And that's why it's so important to stop that momentum and that revolutionary spirit. And they weren't able to do it in Egypt, they weren't able to do it in Tunis, but they are trying to do it in Syria. And when you see a violent conflict and war and something that people have been calling sectarianism and so on, who wants that in their country, people are going to refract and stop that revolutionary process in their country. So that's the second reason for why the US is really interested in this long war of attrition in Syria. But I'm going to argue that this is also changing because a long war of attrition, unfortunately for the US, cannot go for too long because jihadi are becoming too powerful, and this is not something that the US want to have in the region. And that's why we are seeing a convergence between Russia and the US. And as, again, Nader summarized it, and I love it, I use the same slogan. The main difference right now between Russia and the US is Assadism without Assad, and Assadism with Assad. And I think they're even willing to negotiate that and reach some kind of consensus. And thirdly, there is also the Orientalist framework. There is racism. There is this tendency to think the Arabs, Arabs equate Islam, equate pious, equate, and it goes, it's gradual until they're terrorists and they're jihadi, and what they're doing is not about democracy, but rather about Sharia and and obviously there are some of those people, but for the most part, people are fighting and willing to lose their lives because they are building a democratic society. And I think this is important to understand. I'm going to give this example from Sarah Palin because I think she's really good at summarizing this political debate here in the US when she was rejecting any US intervention in Syria because the jihadi and so on. She said, "Let Allah sort it out. Why should we go there and lose lives and when they're just jihadi and extremists fighting each other?" And so the chemical attacks were really a great opportunity for the US, who didn't really want to lose face. They drew so many red lines, and every time the despots were crossing those lines, and it was almost funny. And they took that opportunity to reach a kind of or strike a kind of deal with Russia, and now we see that they are postponing the process of containment of Russia or projecting it to East Asia and Central Asia. There was an interesting report from RAND a few years ago, from 2008, that was studying the situation in the Middle East. And it estimates that the Middle East will still dominate oil production for years to come, and that this region will be the main base for jihadi and for terrorists and al-Qaeda. And the study suggests that, and here I'm quoting the study, divide and rule, which focuses on exploiting fault lines between the various Salafi jihadi groups to turn them against each other and dissipate their energy on internal conflicts. This strategy relies heavily on covert action, information operation, unconventional warfare, and support to indigenous security forces. And this is what they have done in Iraq, and this is what they intend to do in Syria, and this is their whole strategy in the region. Russia has a different take to the Syrian revolution, and again, Russia is a different type of imperialism, and I like that. When people complexify imperialism and not just throw imperialism, and I think imperialism is very messy, very complex, very contradictory, and we have to deal with those contradictions, not just say, as I will explain later with our dear friends, the internationalists who are siding with the Bashar regime, have a tendency to oversimplify. So the Russians were very skeptical of the Arab Revolution very early on, since the Tunisian and the Russian and the Egyptian Revolution. They didn't wait for the Syrian Revolution to happen to take a stance against the Arab revolt. And the reason why is because they see that as a conspiracy, and they think that the US is really manipulating all that, and that this is a replica of the color revolution that happened in some Central Asian countries, in places like Georgia and Ukraine. And their close allies are despotic regime, very much like the Arab despots. Places like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan could be threatened seriously if this revolutionary momentum and spirit goes on and contaminate Central Asia. And even Russia is threatened. If you remember, during the elections, there were revolts, and some people were writing about that and comparing this with the Arab revolts. And many of the sociologists and people who influence the decision-making and politicians, and here I'm talking about intellectuals, I'm not talking about the politicians, who have a say in the decision-making in Russia, have a tendency to tell that story, that this is a conspiracy, that we should have, we should pursue our Eurasian project, and that we should side with Assad because there is a real possibility of contagion in our region. In addition to that, Russia has, and I think this has been said many, many times, but I don't think this is as important as some people want to make it seem, that Russia has a naval facility in Tartus, and they want to keep that unique access to the Mediterranean, and they have investment in Syria valued to $19 billion in 2009. But again, I don't think that's really as important as the other reasons. So this is the first geopolitical maps that that I call the mini Cold War between Russia and the US. The second one is more like a regional proxy war between Iran and its allies on the one hand, and then Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel on the other. Here again, there are divergences because of the weakness of both sides, the Russian and the US. And so the allies are not very loyal, and they have their own agenda. And the ground has been shifting more recently, as we have seen. So, for example, Iran has been talking to Turkey because they have an interest in curbing the influence of al-Qaeda. In addition, Turkey is very disappointed with Saudi Arabia because what Saudi Arabia did in Egypt, the coup against the Muslim Brotherhood, and as you know, Turkey has type of Muslim Brotherhood government, and therefore they're not very happy with Saudi Arabia. They also believe that Saudi Arabia is funding some of the Salafi group in Syria, groups that are fighting the Turkey allies in Syria, and so on. So they're not necessarily a happy family. They're not necessarily closely allied. And since the election of Hassan Rouhani and this new Iranian politics of ending the sanctions, we have seen a lot of changes. The defense minister, Akbar Toqan, declared during the presidential elections in Iran, he said, and he was critiquing the sanctions, and he wanted to really, those sanctions, to be, he wants to be over. He said, and here I'm quoting, "Who can say that imposing various sanctions on the country is a revolutionary move and in line with serving the political system and the people? In our opinion, rationalism is revolutionary." And this is how he's justifying basically the talks between Iran and the US. And I won't go further. I think we can say many things about the relationship between Hezbollah and Syria and Iran, and why is that, and how strategic is that, and how much Iran is willing to sacrifice Assad. And there is a real conversation, by the way, inside Iran. Two camps, one really wanting Assad, another one willing to sacrifice Assad for a better deal with the US and so on. The third one, and here again, it's not a state actor, but they have, they're thinking like a state and they're acting like a state, and that's the religious jihadi al-Qaeda, and they have actually a map. They drew a map. When you're thinking like a state, you have to act like a state. They have their own map, and they have weird names for the Arab countries, and and so for Al-Qaeda, it's very simple. It's a Manichaean worldview. It's binary. It's black and white. It's a clash of civilization. It's the Sunni against the non-Sunni. It's the believers against the infidels. And this is how it's been going on. Obviously, there is not much room for any kind of discussion. They're against democracy. They're against dignity that the Syrians are and rose up for. They're against all the slogans and everything that the Syrians are fighting for. And as Nader and others did a great job in showing the close relationship between the jihadi and the Syrian government. And I just want to add to what he said earlier, that in addition to releasing 1,500 jihadi who became leaders and big players in the military aspect of the revolution, in 2012, February 2012, the Syrian Authority announced the release of Abu Mus'ab al-Suri. And for those of you who are interested in the jihadi movement and follow up, his name is Mustafa bin Abdul Ghadir Sikmirian. He's one of the most important and prominent theorists of Salafi jihadism globally, not just in Syria. And the US was extremely upset with that, but obviously they couldn't do much. And so again, as Nader was saying, at the same time, activists and peaceful protesters and organizers were put in jail and tortured and killed, and those people, the jihadi and people who are, real criminals, were released. Big question mark. I'm not a big fan of conspiracy theory, but I do believe that there is a common interest, and we're seeing that every time that there is a major battle between the Syrian regime and the FSA and other groups, you see al-Qaeda taking another city. They don't take it, when it's peaceful. They take it when there is a major battle. Again, big question mark. But the Syrian regime is not alone to have done that. And for almost a year, there was almost no jihad. All the jihadi narrative that we have been hearing and that make so many internationalists and leftists happy now because it's even simpler, the jihadi, were not even present the first year of the revolution. But this was possible because of the Gulf funding of certain groups and strengthening them. And as I said, the pious Syrian who, out of desperation, are willing more and more to listen to some of those jihadi, and therefore we're going to see more of that in the long run, if it goes on for too long. And then we have the split between Iran, Hezbollah, and the Iraqi Shiite brigades, and on the one hand, and then Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar on the other, and again Sunni Shia split. The only people who are messing that up are the white supremacists, for those of you who don't know, who joined the Assad forces and are fighting with Assad. And they're coming from all over. There are Russian white supremacists, there are Greek white supremacists, they're coming even from France. And if you're interested in that debate, they have plenty of information on their website, and I'll tell you how to go there. Yeah, that's the only thing that's really mixing up things and confusing people. Is it really about Shia and Sunni? No, it's not. It's also about white supremacists. There is also a fourth actor, and again, they're not state, but they're again thinking like a state and acting like a state, and that's the Kurdish traditional parties. In the beginning, the Kurdish movement was very vibrant. It was grassroots. And I think there are still remains of that, but they were undermined and violently curbed by the Syrian regime, mostly, obviously. Many were killed, many were arrested, but the traditional Kurdish group were also participating in that. Because obviously when you have a traditional party with many, many members, 10,000 members in the case of the Democratic Union Party, and you have fighters and so on, you don't want any kind of competition, and the grassroots Kurdish movement was a real competition to them. And they wanted, and they embraced the Syrian Revolution. They didn't really have a state interest. Whereas the traditional Kurdish movement is thinking like a state and acting as a state, and they have maps and so on. And that's, again, a very long story, but a very complex one. The Iraqi Kurds are not necessarily in agreement with the Syrian ones, and the Turks have their disagreement and so on. But again, this could be one of the players. The fifth one is, and this is the final one, and again, this is a very unconventional one, but I'm putting them here because they're not a state, but they're acting, again, like a state. Okay. And that's the media, the leftist media, the global international movement, the non-aligned movement, and so on. And I will just say that they have been simplifying and decomplexifying the Syrian issue, and really acting like the jihadi. It's a Manichaean word. It's blue. It's white and black, and it's a binary. I will say just very briefly a few things about Manbij. after this long geopolitical reading. And just to say that this geopolitical reading is not new. I mean, we knew all that. There is very little new. There is very little that we didn't really know. And so those people who are surprised and shocked that the US is intervening in the region, that French are doing that, and Qatari are funding, well, we knew all that. I mean, what's new? What's new is really the revolution. And what's new is what do we do knowing that, this is geopolitical reading? That's the real question. And that's the surprising thing that leftists should be doing much more and aren't doing. And I think we should be doing. And so I can talk more about Manbij, my experience in Manbij. I just want to say that there are two major political bodies in Manbij, the city. There is the Revolutionary Council and there is the trustee councils. The Revolutionary Council is the executive power, and it's made of people who were the revolutionaries. They were put in prison, they were tortured, and their teachers, their lawyers, they left everything, and they're paid. For those of you who are interested, the president of the Revolutionary Council is paid $40 a month, and people are making donations to make that happen because the state doesn't give any revenues. There are no revenues for operating budget for the council. And then there is the legislative power, which is the trustee council, made of 600 members, and that's a very diverse body. Everyone can be part of that. The only problem is that there are informants in the city, and every time there is a meeting, and I've been to 5 or 6 of them, the informants tell the regime, and there are airplanes above our heads. And so there was always this fear of being, the airstrike, and there was a real possibility. Just an anecdote, because some of you might not know that the regime doesn't hit any al-Qaeda headquarters, any al-Qaeda or fundamentalist or jihadi groups. Whenever they are in the city, especially in the liberated areas, they let them do their things, and they know that they're going to do a great job for the regime. And again, this is not conspiracy, but this is a question that we should ask and try to answer. And they go and bomb schools, bakeries, and hospitals. The free teacher in Manbij, for example, decided that the attendance rate last year was 20%. Very few kids were going to school, and they wanted to raise that to 80% this year. And obviously the news reached the government or the regime very quickly. The next day they sent 2 airplanes and they hit 2 empty schools to send a signal to the city that don't even go there. You can't have a functioning city. And this is again, the regime really understands that the real revolution is that. And the real threat is building that democracy, that city, making it livable, and so on. And I have many examples, but I will stop here. Thank you.